Here are three random horror stories that I found from around the Lone Star State. I hope they creep you out just as much as they did to me. So turn down your lights, put on some headphones, and here are three horror stories from Texas. I have had many experiences of the supernatural sort, but I must tell you of the most horrible experience ever. As a child, my brothers and sisters and I had always been in trouble for things none of us had done. Something would be missing or moved, and when our parents asked, none of us knew how it had happened. We would counsel with each other after our parents went away and admit who had really done it, but a lot of the times it was none of us. Eventually, after hearing a lifetime of noises, feeling like someone was watching us, and being terrified at night, we got used to it and accepted that there was a ghost that liked to get us in trouble. I think the spirit first came to us in Birmingham, Alabama. We moved many times. It seems the spirit followed us all over Alabama and Texas. It did take a while to catch up to us every time we moved, especially from Alabama to Texas. When I was 15, when we moved to Niederwald, Texas, my older siblings had moved out on their own by then. It was my parents, myself, and my brother. Things began to happen right away. Items being moved around, noises, terrifying nights full of that I'm watching you feeling. One night I was awakened by something unknown, but I was too afraid to get up. My bed began to shake. When I did open my eyes, I saw three witches, hags, or whatever you want to call them. They circled around my bed at the ceiling of my room. They were either one entity split into three, or they were triplets, identical and sinister. They circled around me, laughing and chanting over and over, "You're mine, you're mine." I finally yelled at them to go away and ran to my parents' room. My parents let me sleep on their floor and gave me the family Bible for comfort. They didn't say then whether they believed me. When we got up in the morning, I felt very foolish. I had always tried to convince myself things like this were just my imagination. I apologized to my parents for disturbing their sleep and described in detail what had happened. No one really said anything. I think they thought I was ill or something, and I could tell they were worried about me, but not really convinced anything supernatural had occurred. When my dad was leaving the house to go to work that day, he yelled for us to come look. There was a 10-inch wooden cross nailed to the wall right by the front door. The nail was tacked to the very top of the cross. The cross was upside down on the nail. It had rotated on its own. We don't question these experiences anymore. This particular encounter happened one evening in June when my mother and I set off walking toward the back of our property to repair a section of the fence that had been damaged by one of our cows. She and I did not plan on being out there very long, but in case we were out there after dark, we brought along a couple of flashlights. As I recall, there was at least a couple of hours of daylight left and the sky was slightly overcast. As we were walking, we talked about work, our upcoming vacation, and other things, and in general became lost in our conversation and paid no attention to our surroundings. After a half hour into our trek, my mom abruptly stopped walking and I almost smacked right into her. I was walking right behind her. When I asked her why she had stopped, she told me to be very still and not make any sudden movements. As she said this, she was staring at the pasture to my left, which was enclosed by a simple barbed wire fence a couple of feet away from where we stood. Following her gaze, I received the biggest shock of my life, for not 10 feet away from us was a large pair of glowing reddish-orange eyes. I at first took it to be an animal, but on closer inspection it became apparent that what we were observing was not an animal at all. The first thing I noted was that the eyes were looking directly at us and were chest level with me. I'm about 5.5 feet high, and they were almond-shaped reddish in color. No whites were visible, with small black rounded pupils, and they were unnaturally large. I'd say about palm-sized. The one feature that made the eyes all the more frightening was that they were not attached to anything at all, but hung suspended in midair. Both of us could plainly see the scraggly brush behind the eyes. The ground below them, there was no body or feet, and the air around them, there was no face attached to them. There was a slight mist of dust swirling in the air around us during the encounter, which possibly came from the pasture. The cattle grazing in there had worn the ground to powder, but not one of us was moving. So how the dust was kicked up is anybody's guess. I'd say the entire duration of the encounter lasted less than 3 minutes, during which time my mother and I had enough sense to try to find a rational explanation for what we were seeing. My mother shone the flashlight directly on the eyes and they did not respond. The pupils did not contract, nor did the thing's gaze shift to where my mother stood, but remained fixed on me. I recall after this test was completed, my mother told me to move slowly backward toward the center of the pasture and begin walking home. We did so, and after turning our backs, began to walk briskly back towards the house. My curiosity was too great, and I dared to look back, but the thing was gone, and without so much as a sound or a puff of dust. To this day, nearly 5 years later, we have no explanation as to what it is we saw, and we have never seen it again. I have been reluctant to talk about this to anyone. If there is anyone who has a theory as to what this thing is, I would greatly like to know. My encounter happened when I was about 15 years old. On this particular night, I happened to be with my older sister who was 21 back then. She was married and had to babysit me because my mom had left to go to Mexico with my brother. That night I could have gone to sleep whenever I had wanted to, but for some reason I went to bed at 8. Before I went though, my sister told me if I needed something, she would be in what was then my bedroom and my brother-in-law. I fell asleep, and about 5 till midnight I had an urge to go to the bathroom, so I did. And I finished right at midnight. When I was about to leave the bathroom, I had a feeling that I should look at my brother's room that was in front of the bathroom. So I did. And what I saw was very scary. All my life, I had the ability to see, feel, and talk to the dead. It was pitch black in my brother's room, and even though it was like that, I was able to see this tall, dark figure that scared me. I was able to see that he was wearing a trench coat and a hat kind of like a cowboy's hat. I got scared and went to my sister's room, but she didn't open when I knocked. I started to kick the door very hard, and still I didn't get an answer. It was like whatever was in my brother's room was making my sister and my brother-in-law not to hear me. I didn't know what to do, so I went back to the room where I was staying and started to pray, but still felt like it was following me. But then all of a sudden I saw my grandmother, father's mother, who had passed away many years before. She told me she knew there was something bad in my house, but she was not going to let whatever there was there hurt me or anyone else there. And as soon as I fell asleep, it was gone. The next morning I woke up like nothing had ever happened. To this day, I wonder what that thing was.